Welcome to Generous Theology, with Chuck and Brock. The fellows are talking today from Chapter 19, by Professor Cecilia Trefogli, from the book, The Cambridge History of Medieval Philosophy.
Yeah, I agree. And one of the things that I marked when I read this and didn't get a chance to just go back and look at, but it's interesting, is, as you've pointed out, the physics really began to be widely studied around the middle of the 13th century. But it's interesting that it was first made available to the Latin world around 1125, 1135, 1140, in that area. But it took almost, well, maybe even more than 100 years for it to take. And then all of a sudden, in the 13th century and also the 14th, you just get tons of commentaries and tons of people working off of it. But I like your analogy of the changing tide, because I think there is a sense that probably counts for that 100-year gap between the first availability of the physics in the Latin world and the real sort of push in people studying it, commenting on it, using it, arguing about it. It takes a little while for those things to take, and maybe took that 100 years. Now, maybe there's some other things going on in history at that point, and that's what that might have played a role there as well. But it is interesting to me how it takes about 100 years to take after it's available in Latin again. But then once it takes, man, oh man, does it take. And it's like a tide that just keeps crashing onto the shores, and people have to keep dealing with it. So that is very interesting.
Yeah, there's an idea here that gains some traction from this. And I'm painting a narrative here, Chuck, that I think is warranted by the text, and I think warranted by other things, other evidences that we could point to. But it's a narrative. And maybe like other narratives, it can be subject to aggrandizement, turning into tall tales. They used to say, if you had somebody from Texas, you had to be careful, because you'd ask them an answer to a question and they'd tell you a tall tale or a story about how everything was bigger in Texas. And that would distort the narrative. And of course, for humorous effect, but the idea is that narratives can be distorted. What am I trying to say? What I'm trying to say is I'm trying to acknowledge that it's this reintroduction of Aristotle and the succeeding excitement. And so you can paint a narrative, as some do, especially on the secular side, that there was this pent up frustration from humankind only having the Bible and Christian theological works to draw from for 500, 600 years, maybe since Augustine, maybe since Pope Gregory the Great. Let's maybe push it back in a little bit more. So you have 400, 500, 600 years of nothing else to read but theology. Now, that's a little overly simplified. It's not quite like that, but that's worth noting that there is some truth to that narrative. In the quote-unquote Dark Ages that represented the early centuries of the medieval period, it's fair to say that there was a loss to society of literary material. And so it's fair to call it a Dark Age. And it's fair to say that substantial portions of Europe at that time, really, their primary intellectual endeavors revolved around theology and the Bible and church life. And so this is a germ that many secularists have done just what the Texans have done. They've turned it into a tall tale in which there's this 500 and 600 year period where the church did nothing but hold back or impede humanity's development. Now, is that accurate or not? And I think the answer is no. Because first of all, there was no conspiracy to hold these things back. The empires from classical antiquity fell, and life became harder. Mortality rates went up, life expectancy went down. It became, by most human flourishing standards, regression. And none of that was a conspiracy. None of that was directly related to one society pushing humankind in another direction or another society pushing back. This happened in a sense, maybe the right word to use is organically. And so it's really not fair to charge the church with instigating this dark period. As a matter of fact, it might even be said, if we want to push the narrative maybe in the opposite direction, and I'd love to actually discuss with some historians and other theologians about this, the idea that really everything else collapsed. And why didn't the church? In a sense, the Augustinian vision of the city on a hill maybe came to pass. It might be that of all the centers of learning, of all the economic progress that classical civilization had developed, everything non secular collapsed, and the only thing that bootstrapped and survived and enabled the rediscovery was the learning of the church. In other words, the church might have been the only thing that actually was able to survive, in which case you can look at it as much a preserver. And I think you can pull the narrative perhaps in both directions, but I would love to talk with someone else about that over this time period because I think it's a fascinating thing. Have you heard that narrative as well, Chuck? And what's your thoughts when people maybe talk about that with you?
Yeah, I've heard that narrative and I've heard the opposite narrative. It's interesting that in the past, the opposite narrative, the idea that Christianity really was not the cause for the Dark Ages, but really was the preserver against the Dark Ages. I think for the most part, I've heard that from Christian historians and Christian thinkers, but it does seem to be that idea. There's a British historian by the name of Tom Holland. I don't know that you're familiar with him. And I haven't read any of his stuff yet. I've just been seeing some of his comments being engaged with social media and some discussions. And he apparently has come to the conclusion as a atheist historian that actually that narrative that Christianity may be what actually preserved knowledge and led to flowering of the Renaissance as opposed to holding it in check during the Dark Ages. That's the direction that he's begun to go. And it's been interesting to see there are people who are bucking up against that idea, and there are a lot of people who really like the idea, but maybe only like it because this just makes Christianity look good. But it does seem like that he has done some real thinking about that and has been presenting that. I know he's somewhat of a popular historian on a number of programs, BBC and things like that. But yeah, that's the direction he seems to be going. It'll be interesting to see if there are others who take that up.